This program is part of WQED's Pittsburgh History Series.
It was Christmas time, 1989, and our WQED TV crew was driving to New York City. We knew a secret. Pittsburgh Magazine, in its upcoming January issue, was going to name the playwright August Wilson Pittsburgher of the Year. And in local programming, we always made a half-hour TV documentary about the honoree. Since August Wilson was in New York City rehearsing for the Broadway premiere of his new play, The Piano Lesson, we had to go there. We met Mr. Wilson on December 22nd. He already knew about the upcoming honor.
Well, does this whole Pittsburgher of the Year thing strike you as funny or great, or how does it strike you?
I think ironic one, I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I live in Pittsburgh 33 years. I never got very much from the city, you know. So I left and I went to Minnesota. So I think it's kind of poetic justice, you might say, even, and also I find it a bit ironic. But it's great. Me, Pittsburgher of the Year, come on.
We talked for almost 2 hours, and pieces of the interview have been used in several programs, including in the documentary called August Wilson, The Ground on Which I Stand, produced for the PBS series American Masters. Now, after more than 30 years, we thought it might be worthwhile to share more of that interview. I want to call this Brain, Space, and Energy, my interview with August Wilson.
Is all of this fun for you? I mean,
It can be, and most times it is. It can be, it can be tiring. You know, at various points. I mean, you do get burnout, and you have to sort of brace up because, for instance, I go through this. We open the show in January 17th in Los Angeles, and February 26th I start rehearsals for Two Trains Running, which opens March 27th, and then Piano Lesson opens in New York April 16th, and you know, and somehow you have to juggle all that and find brain space and energy, you know, to go through what can be very exhaustive kind of routines or rehearsals. So I look forward to May when I can, you know, rest a minute and take a break. But it's fun in the sense of watching your work come to life and things like that. Yeah, it can be both exciting and fun and tiring and exhaustive.
At that point in December 1989, Wilson was 44 years old and about halfway through what would become known as his Pittsburgh cycle of 10 plays.
Of course, the life I know best is Black life in Pittsburgh. I lived there I was born and lived there 33 years. And there's a lot of experiences and a lot of things that I conjure up or call up. But all the plays, with the exception of Ma Rainey, are set in Pittsburgh and based on Pittsburgh, and it's about the life in Pittsburgh that I know. So it's all there.
August Wilson was born April 27, 1945, and he was named Frederick August Kittel after his father, a German baker, who was not around much as the boy grew up. His mother, Daisy Wilson, raised him, originally in rooms at the back of this house.
I grew up in on the Hill District. I lived on Bedford Avenue, and I guess my earliest memories are third, fourth grade, coming home from school. And as I got older, I gradually came to understand that we lived in a mixed neighborhood. The neighborhood, there was a lot of Syrians, a lot of Italians, blacks in there. It was I think in every sense of the word, a neighborhood, which I think that it may be all across America that neighborhoods are no longer what they used to be. But I remember like coming home from school and all the parents would be sitting out, and they would have congregated at the local grocery stores as opposed to the A&P. And they met there and they stood around in the afternoon and talked about what they were going to cook for supper. Oh, Daisy, what are you cooking today? I'm cooking this, etc. It was life in the 50s, I guess, in America was very much different than the life that we know today. So I recall those kinds of things. However, one was always aware, right, as a child, become aware because all the symbols of all the people in authority that you see, and that's everyone from the streetcar conductor to the principal at the school to the person that owns the store to the person in the welfare office. All these people are white. So you gradually get a sense that all positions of authority, and I think this is something that you discover early on, that this is a situation. And I think this is something that influences and marks your life as a black person in America.
August's mother, Daisy, who had passed away from lung cancer 6 years before this interview, was a crucial influence on his early life and the lives of his 3 sisters and 2 brothers.
She taught us all how to read. I learned how to read when I was 4 years old. I had my library card when I was 5, and in kindergarten they used to take me up to the 3rd grade and give me their book and let me read to the class at Lecce School when I started kindergarten there. But she, to her, reading was everything, because if you can read, you could learn. Like Marshall McLuhan said, the book is a computer, and reading is a key that can unlock it. And so she instilled in all of us, my brothers and sisters. She taught us all how to read, and she would, on occasion, read to us. And reading was of importance to her. Language was important, although she herself had only had a 6th grade education. So yeah, I got that I got the idea of reading, and she would take me to the library, and I would get these library books and read. And, so the reading and words were, early on in my life, a very important part of it.
Although the family was not strictly Roman Catholic, Daisy put great value on parochial education and enrolled young Freddie in Catholic schools in the Hill District and then in Hazelwood after the family moved there in 1958.
Probably around 7th grade is when I got 6th grade, actually. I went to, at that time, was St. Richard's School, Catholic school on Bedford Avenue there. And I had a teacher, Sister Mary Christopher, and she was very encouraging, and I was writing a book. She would take these things that, she allowed me to write stories and to read them to the class. And then she would put them in a book, and I'd go off and write another story. So she was very encouraging, and I began to write. And all of the writing assignments that we'd had in elementary school and even at Central Catholic, all the assignments, somehow I did well at that. I liked the idea of writing, and I was able to, write, I suspect, interesting, things, and construct a sentence. And I always try. I remember I started writing poetry in 7th grade for Nancy Ireland. And Nancy Ireland was the girl in the school that even the 3rd graders were in love with, So I wrote these poems for her, and I would put them on her desk, and I didn't sign my name to them. You see, now I suspect all my life I've still been writing poems for Nancy Ireland. Only her name has changed many times, but I learned to put my name on the poem now. But I started, and poetry was. I think most people believe, actually, it's easier to write than, say, a short story. There you got to have a plot, you got to have sentences, but a poem you can, It's actually, of course, the most difficult art form, the highest written art form, I think, and which is why I still pursue it so passionately, because I want to at least write one good poem. But I just had a fascination with the words, and the idea that words can say things, and that you can twist them and turn them, and the idea of metaphor and things like this just intrigued me. It was a whole world there to be explored. had a very kind of, I guess, unique school career. I started high school at Central Catholic High School in 1959, and it was not a very nice place to go to school. My first encounter with both personal and institutional racism.
Wilson didn't last long at Central Catholic, took himself out. He then tried classes at Connolly Trade School, more trouble there, and after the family moved to Hazelwood, he went to Gladstone High School. But he soon decided he wasn't being treated fairly there either.
So what I would do is I would get up in the morning, because I didn't want my mother to know that I wasn't going to school. So I would get up in the morning and I would leave the house as though I were going to school, and I would walk over to Oakland and go to the library. And I would spend the day in the library and come on back home as though I were going to school. I did this maybe for 3 or 4 months, and because I actually didn't have to get up in the morning, I started sleeping in later and later. And finally one day I told my mother that I quit school, that I didn't choose to go anymore. And she told me to go find a job, and that was her response to that. But that is what happened in regard to my academic career.
Tell me the tales that to me were so dear, long, long ago, long, long ago.
1965, I lived on St. Vincent de Paul. I lived on Fifth Avenue. I'm trying to remember the address now. It was right across the street from the St. Vincent de Paul store. And Monsignor Bassompierre ran the St. Vincent de Paul store. I used to serve Mass for him when I was a kid. Anyway, I didn't have a record player, and I didn't have music. I didn't have the wherewithal to get that. But at St. Vincent de Paul one day, I discovered a record player. It played 78 records that I bought for $3. And they had stacks of records that were nickel a piece. And I would go, whenever I had extra 50 cents, I'd go over there and pick 10 records. And I was very indiscriminate about which ones I picked. As long as it was a record and it had some music on it, that's all I wanted. And I would take them home and I'd listen to them, and I don't like this one, I like this one, I don't like this one. And what they were mostly records, the virtual history of the popular music of the 30s and 40s. All the big band sounds, and anyone, Patti Page, and everything was in there. And one day in my stack of records, there was a yellow label record that had a typewritten label, and it was by someone named Bessie Smith, and it was odd because of this typewritten label. And I put it on, my thing, and the song was "Nobody in Town Could Bake a Sweet Jelly Roll Like Mine." And I listened to it, and it was so unlike anything that I'd ever heard in all of these other records that it was literally, I was stunned by it. I didn't know that this thing existed, this kind of music, and to hear her voice.
In a bakery shop today, I heard Miss Mary Jenkins say, "You've had the best cake you see."
It suddenly had something to do with me. This was someone who was talking to me, whereas Patti Page wasn't talking to me. Patti Page was singing a song. And I listened to the song, and I listened to it again, and I listened to it, and I listened to it like 22 straight times. I just listened to this over and over.
Nobody in town can bake a sweet jelly roll like mine, like mine.
And then I turned it on the other side, and there was a song called "If You Don't, I Know Who Will," was the other side. Now, as I since discovered, neither of these is Bessie's best records, but that was my introduction. And I immediately got up the next day and ran over to St. Vincent de Paul, and I'm looking through the stacks for another Bessie Smith. I mean, I spent 4 or 5 hours there that day looking at all those records, and I could not find a Bessie Smith. But I began to search out. I began to get discriminate. I was looking for something that said blues. as opposed to foxtrot, you know. And as a lot of them said foxtrot, whether they were or weren't, you know. And occasionally I stumbled across some other records by primarily women blues. Lil Green, Romance in the Dark is another one I recall that I had on 78. And then I began to discriminate and began to research and search out this music that I discovered. And that was really my beginning discovery of not only of blues, but of a music that spoke to me. And this led me to, in concert with some other things, this led me to alter the way that I looked at the world and the way that I looked at the people around me and the way I looked at my grandmother in her life, because Bessie represented her in that sense. And so I began to discover in my grandmother's life a richness and a fullness that I had not known had existed before. I think the blues are the cultural response of Black America to the situation that they found themselves in. I think that if you look at the blues, there's an entire philosophy at work in the blues, the ideas and attitudes of the people, their values, the things they sanction, I found all in blues music. For instance, if you did not know anything, I mean, if someone gave you a record and you knew nothing whatsoever about the people who made that music, the music would inform you of their grace, their passion, their social conduct, their social organization. It would imbue you, in fact, of their culture. I think it's an encapsulation of Black America's cultural ideas, which were preserved in the blues, being that we come out of an oral history in which the information is passed along orally. The music then provides you with an emotional reference for the information, so it serves a dual focus. And the idea, of course, with oral information, it has to be repeated. And what better way to have information repeated than to sing it? And someone would sing the song, and that is what it kept alive, the information. So I think, in all of the art, including jazz and written art, all of the art that Black America has created can be traced back to the blues impulse, or the cultural, initial cultural impulse of Black Americans, which is the blues. Well, I think, for instance, I think Pittsburgh is, I mean, what's happening in Pittsburgh in terms of what the Black community is happening in Cleveland, Newark, Detroit, Harlem, it's happening all over. It's the same thing. There are some specifics, of course, in Pittsburgh, but I think in writing about the Black experience, the experience in Pittsburgh, of Blacks in Pittsburgh, I think is, for the most part, typical of the whole experience of Blacks. So, since that's what I know, I continue to set the plays there. But I think it encompasses all the cities. I mean, they could very well be set in Cleveland, because the things that happen in the plays are things that happen in Black American life, wherever it's at.
But some locations in Pittsburgh made an impact on the young man in the Hill District.
Pat's Place on Wally Avenue. There's a couple of things with Pat's Place. One, I read Claude McKay's Home to Harlem, in which he mentioned Pat's Place. And the railroad porters in the 20s and 30s used to hang out at Pat's Place. And I said, oh, I know where that's at. Of course, it had moved from where it used to be down around on Fullerton and Wally, and it moved up to further up Wally, I guess 1800 block of Wally. And when I was about 22, 23, in Pittsburgh at that time, when every day had to be continually negotiated, and I found it very difficult. And I wasn't sure I was going to make 24, and I wasn't. And I saw an elderly man walking up the street, 65 years old, and I wondered how it was that he had managed to live that long, and I wanted to find out, how do you do that? So I followed him into Pat's Place. And these guys would sit around in there and stand around, actually, and talk. They would talk everything, history, philosophy, the news of the day, the papers, this, that, and the other. And a lot of things, I stood around listening because I wanted to learn something. And I found out some of the stuff I was able to use later on in my place. For instance, I recall walking in there one day, and one guy standing around, he just happens to say that he says, yeah, I come up Pittsburgh, I come Pittsburgh in '39. So you come up on a B&O Railroad. I look, I said, no, you ain't. You ain't come up on a B&O. So I don't know what railroad you come up on, but you didn't come up on a B&O Railroad, because B&O Railroad didn't stop in Pittsburgh in '39. He said, well, you gonna tell me what the train I got? He said, yeah, I'm gonna tell you the truth. You tell me you come on B&O, you didn't stop there. So everybody that came in the place, hey, Fillmore, he said he come up on, tell the man, the train ain't stopped and the B&O ain't stopped in Pittsburgh in '39. And on. That went on for like a week about what train this guy rode on this particular railroad. And I was able to use that in, something very similar in Ma Rainey. So it's those kinds of things. But more importantly, I think, is the ideas and attitudes of the community, as looking on them as the elders of the community, and the things that they sanctioned, the conducts that they sanctioned, and the ideas and attitudes which had been passed along to them as young men. Those were the things that I honed in on as I sought to discover what it is that the community demanded of me, and what it is, how best I could, what was expected of me as a man, and how best I could live my life. I first got into theater in 1968 with the Black Horizons Theater that I started with my friend Rob Penny on the Hill District with the idea of politicizing the community. This was in the middle of the Black Power movement. I felt it both a duty and honor to participate in altering the relationship of blacks to the society in which we lived in. And so, but I couldn't write plays, though. I tried to write plays, and I couldn't write dialogue. And even in my short fiction, there was very little dialogue in the fiction. And when I moved to St. Paul, three things happened. One, I got a job at the Science Museum in Minnesota, writing scripts for a theater troupe that was attached there. And we were doing like adapting tales of the Northwest Indians. And the second thing is, I began for the first time to listen or to hear the voices of the people that I had grown up with all my life, you see, which I think most importantly, I didn't value. I didn't value the way that blacks spoke. I thought in order to make it into literature that you had to change it, which is why I couldn't write dialogue. But once my friend Rob Penny told me that, I asked him once, I said, how do you make them talk? He says, you don't, you listen to them. And once I began to listen to them and value and respect the way that they talked, then it was easy to write dialogue. It became my strongest suit. And not only was it easy to write dialogue, but I found out that the characters had things that they wanted to say. And so my other friend, Claude Purdy, in St. Paul, was a director, and his friend was a playwright. I mean, was a writer who wasn't writing plays, so that wasn't going to last long, and he kept encouraging me to write a play. So finally, in 1979, I sat down and I wrote a play called Jitney, which was my first realistic play. I had written a few one-acts before that, but that's when I seriously began to divert most of my energies into playwriting. I wrote Jitney, which I set in 1971. Then I wrote a play called Fullerton Street, which I set in 1941. And then I wrote a play called Ma Rainey, which I set in Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which I set in 1927. And it was right about there. I said, oh, I got 3 plays, 3 different decades. Why don't I just continue to do that? And so I didn't set out with any grand scheme in mind. It was just something I more or less stumbled on because I wrote my first 3 plays in different decades. And I just decided to continue to do that, and which has been helpful because it's provided me with a framework. I just finished the 60s play. I got the 40s and the 80s to go. So then I'll make a decision on which one to write next, and so I have something to write. I write in bars and restaurants, and I can write anywhere at any time. I don't need to be secluded off anywhere. That's some people's requirements. I'm not knocking that. I'm just not that kind of person. So I can always have a pencil and a piece of paper, and I mean, I can write snatches of dialogue or write a scene. I can sit down and write a scene, and etc. So I can write wherever I'm at. So, and I demand myself that I continue to work. All of the characters on the stage are, in essence, myself. They are all made up out of myself. And writing is like walking, you know, down this landscape of the self. And you have to be willing to confront whatever it is that you've discovered and to deal with it. And this can sometimes be a very difficult thing to do, and it is like wrestling with your demons until hopefully you emerge at the end with a larger truth, and you emerge to find that your spirit has gotten larger, and that your demons, in fact, are not as large as they seem to be before. That in the process of wrestling with them, that you have strengthened yourself, and I think that's what writing is for me. It comes out of the self, and you're forced to confront what is there, what you discover, if you're going to be honest.
Wilson's honesty and his belief in the importance of theater made him one of the most important playwrights in American history. The year after this interview, he won his second Pulitzer Prize for The Piano Lesson, the play then in rehearsals. He would go on to complete 10 major plays, one set in each decade of the 20th century, often referred to as the Century Cycle or the Pittsburgh Cycle. He died of liver cancer in Seattle in October 2005 at the age of 60. He was buried in Pittsburgh. His work may live forever.
You know, I've been writing 24 years, and you take your own measure of your own talent, and I've always thought I was a pretty decent writer, you know. And some things, you know, it didn't have to turn out this way, but it worked out fine.